presentation. I'd like to talk about the things that influence the budget specifically this year, and then give everyone an opportunity to ask budget-related questions. I've also sprinkled in some frequently asked questions that some people have been asking about. So the first frequently asked question is, why was the increase to the budget reported as both 2.1% and 4.45%? The 2.1% deals with the expenditures. So the budget this year is $23,351,674. The proposed budget for next year, you can see along that line, is $23,845,527, and that is a difference of almost $500,000 or 2.1%. So that is one way of expressing the budget. In terms of expenditures, we will be spending 2.1% more next year, should the budget pass, than we're paying this year. The other thing I think it's important to communicate is how much towns are paying to support that budget. And so that 4.54% increase is the money that towns are contributing to support education. So again, those are two completely different numbers. One is the budget-to-budget increase, one is the amount that towns are paying. Going into a little bit more detail about that, you can see on the top row, during the 1920 school year, the budget was $20.7 million. You can see that the town assessments, or the money that was raised, was $13.3 million. Going from left to right, the next year, the budget increased by 3.28%, but the amount that towns paid went down by 2.26%. It would be very unusual for the budget-to-budget increase to match the town increase. It just doesn't happen. And the reason for that is, if you look below, what is highlighted in yellow is within the state's funding formula. So in that 1920 year, towns were required to pay $9.5 million. We received $6 million in state subsidy. This year, going all the way over to the right, towns were required to pay $9.8 million, and we received $7.8 million in state subsidy. So the revenues, or the money that is needed to support the budget, changes, which drives a different increase than the budget-to-budget increase. I'm starting with this particular slide because our budget priorities, anyone who has attended these knows that I am always talking about two things. Number one, meeting the needs of students, and number two, being responsible to taxpayers. If you look at this 5-year range, you will see that in FY20, the money that towns were paying was $13.3 million. In this current year, at the very top, the 24-25 year, towns are paying $13.7 million. That is an increase over 5 years of 3.25%. I think it speaks to the fact that we actually do more than just talk about those priorities. We actually budget according to those priorities. And I'll get back to this a little bit later. As a starting point, you will notice the date. This was a letter I wrote to the town managers and boards of selectmen. It happened on February 26th, and it was not great news. So the initial budgetary information from the state showed that if we kept everything exactly the same in terms of expenditures, it would still drive a $210,000 increase to towns. That's not great news. Imagine trying to run your household as everything you're paying for is increasing in cost. Health insurance costs, fuel costs, electricity costs, everything. And you know that if you did nothing differently, you would still be paying almost 1.5% more. It's very tough to start the process that way. And so again, trying to be transparent, I sent a letter just explaining this is the starting point. This is going to be a challenging budget year. It was a conversation I had with the school board at the start. In terms of state funding, the program that we use is called the Essential Programs and Services Model. And the statutory definition of the model is a mechanism for establishing a minimum sufficient funding level. So we are not talking about funding for a Cadillac model of education. By definition, we're talking about meeting the minimum sufficient funding level. The factors that go into the formula, there are ratios for staffing, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. There are salary indexes. We happen to be in a labor market where the state funds 97% of our salaries. York, for example, is in a labor market where they actually pay 103%. It just depends upon where you are and what labor market you're in. There are operating costs that go into the formula, special education costs, transportation costs, and debt service. For us, that is money that we pay to Freiburg Academy for maintenance of their grounds, as well as the bond. There's a 20-year bond we're paying for that Mollyauket project. And the two really important things to remember that drive funding, whether it's the state formula or the local formula, are valuations and student counts. So the valuations, there's a 3-year average. It's all data reported at the state level that they print on this form that explains our funding. And it's an average of student counts. We report every October 1st, and they do an average, which is why sometimes you'll see 0.5 students for some towns. But those numbers are incredibly important when it comes to school funding. Getting back to staffing ratios, you'll see, according to the state, that you should have, in pre-K and K, a 15-to-1 student ratio. It's a legal requirement for pre-kindergarten programs to have a maximum of 15. 17-to-1 for grades 1 to 5, 17-to-1 for grades 6 to 8. Now, the rest of this gets a little bit complicated. If you can sort of imagine, because we operate 2 schools of under 100 students, these ratios do not work well for us. So if they're saying you should have 315 students for a full-time counselor, that's problematic in a school of 80-plus kids. You should have 1 librarian, and we have 1 librarian. It's a district-wide position. That is not as much of an impact. But obviously, when you're talking about health, a school nurse, 720 to 1, that's problematic because we have 3 schools that we're running. Ed Techs, 103 to 1, that would mean that for this school and for New Suncook, you wouldn't even have a full-time position. For secretaries, you wouldn't have a full-time position here or at New Suncook, and school administration, you would have a portion of that as well. So, in the formula, when it comes to assigning costs, if you look at the 3rd column, you will see percentages there. So the top row is Brownfield. Brownfield has 212 students. We have a total, an average, of 1,064 students. So Brownfield has about 20% of our students. All of those costs that I just talked you through, the operating costs, the salaries, the transportation costs, the special education costs within the formula, that all comes to $16.1 million. The debt for the building project comes to $1.6 million. And then over on the far right at the very bottom, you will see that the state is funding $17.8 million within EPS for our district. That gets split out by those percentages. So Brownfield, by virtue of the fact that they have 20% of students, pays 20% of that $17 million. Denmark, they have 12.45%. They would pay that portion of the $17 million. So I just want you to understand how those costs are assigned in this part. Next, all towns in Maine have valuations, average valuations. Those get reported on the form that we receive every year. And the state assigns a mill expectation, which then establishes what is the most that any town can pay for education before the town receives state funding. And if you look over on the right, that is what that number is. Some of our towns reach that point and receive state funding. Others of our towns do not. So you will see, for example, for Brownfield, which is on the top, we're talking about 254 million for valuations times the 6.1 mills, and that's a maximum of about 1.5 million. So it's establishing the cap.
Can I interrupt a minute?
Sure.
Do the screens that you have, even though the fonts and so forth are different, do they correlate to what's in the packet? Save some scribbling and frustration when the screen disappears?
I would be happy to post the presentation on the website, but I'm not sure that I have
Okay,
these individual slides. I'd be happy to send them out, though.
thank you.
Sure.
Question,
Yeah.
how many students do we have that are going to, from our district, that are going to Freiburg?
I think roughly 400.
No, I mean, how many, like, from this school here, right? They have an option to go to Freiburg?
How many parents requested going there?
Yes, and have their children going there. I'm just curious if that would make an impact on the numbers for the state, on how many students we have going here.
No, because they don't.
If there would be
They
an
don't
option.
differentiate by where you're attending school. They differentiate by where you reside. So whether a Denmark student is attending school at New Sunnybrook or
Right,
Freiburg,
Mike, what I was asking was, is there's, you said on here that we're at a lower percentage for students that go to Brownfield Denmark School, correct? And we have only a certain amount of students because of that, we don't have a proper ratio for teachers to students because we have less students, we have a smaller classroom size. And because of that, the state is costing us, we're losing a bit of state funding because of that, is that correct?
correct.
So would this not be something that we could mitigate by allowing no longer allow the convenience of having parents bring their students to Freiburg and therefore be able to retain more money from the state, and this would be more of an administrative issue than a budget issue?
We could certainly explore it. It's just challenging when families are making that request.
I understand that, but when we're talking about kids having to have teachers in combined classrooms, that becomes an issue where the community needs to get together and just pull up our big kid pants and start doing it. Because unfortunately, the other kids will suffer from this. I don't know if we went through a program like that in a small little community in West Virginia, and it was very detrimental to our students.
Yes?
212 students, does that include the Freiburg Academy students?
Of the 212,
Brownfield students?
yes.
That includes the Freiburg Academy students?
That's the total district number enrolled, K to 12.
Is it broken down somewhere how many students we have, Brownfield has enrolled in Freiburg Academy?
I'm sure Heather would have that number if you would be interested to see it.
I don't know. Is this like $14,000 and change for tuition, right?
More,
14.5.
yeah. So, in terms of assignment of costs, we talked this through. Percentage drives how much each town pays of that 17.8 million. State does a calculation. They have a mill rate. They multiply that times the valuation. That establishes the cap. Anything beyond that becomes state subsidy. And the last part of that calculation is that first column in the middle, total allocation. Those are the assigned cost. The required local is how much the town is required to pay. And then that amount on the far right is the amount that the towns and the district, if you're looking at the bottom, receives in state subsidy. So it's about $7.5 million projected for next year. If you look at the middle column, local required, the towns are required to pay over $10 million to receive that $7 million. So this is, again, all within the state's funding formula. So just giving you a glimpse into why this is a problematic budget year. FY25 is this current fiscal year, 24-25. Within the formula, when the multiplication happened between the valuations and the mill rate, the towns this year were required to pay $9.8 million. We received $7.8 million in subsidy for a total of $17.7 million. Next year, with a different mill rate with higher valuations, towns are being required to pay less, but we're also getting less. So the money that is supporting our budget is about $700,000 less within the funding formula. The problem with that is that our costs haven't decreased. The population of students hasn't decreased in a way that would warrant getting $700,000 less in the funding formula. But this is not something we have control over. The valuations are reported, student enrollments we report, and that goes into the calculation. And this is information that is sent that we just have to deal with. In terms of other aspects of the funding formula, again, I emphasized it is a minimum sufficient. Within the formula, the EPS amount is how much, in terms of costs, are being recognized on that form that is sent by the state. So for all of the staffing that we have, that includes the counselors, the teachers, the ed techs, the nurses, the secretaries, that recognizes 3.3 million. In our budget, that's 4.3 million. So we are getting funded for $1 million less than our actual staffing. 9 to 12, secondary costs. There's a per pupil amount for high school students that we receive for various things. There's economically disadvantaged calculations, homeless, English language learners, all of that. The total we receive for secondary students is about 4.2 million. What we pay for secondary costs is about 6.8 million. That's a detriment of about $2.6 million. Special education costs, what do we receive through the formula? 4.2 million, our actual costs are 5.6. This formula is problematic.
I thought we weren't adding in the high school students because that doesn't go into our budget. The academy's totally separate.
We absolutely add it into our budget because we have to pay for our secondary students. We have an exclusive contract with Freiburg Academy, which dictates what amounts per student that we have to pay.
And that's the 14.5, correct?
Well, it's much more complicated than that. There's a calculation for special education students where we prorate the amounts because we pay all of the costs for special education at Freiburg Academy.
But that falls under a different category.
Absolutely.
I'm talking about the 9 through K.
Yeah, and I'm telling you that because some students are accessing special education courses and are not taking a full course load from Freiburg Academy teachers, we do not have to pay for those that are in special education classes for 4, 5, or 6 periods a day because that's coming out of the special education budget. So I'm just correcting the idea that we pay that amount for every student. We don't pay 14.5 for every student. We pay that for most students.
I'm just talking high school students.
That's what I'm saying, yes. Special ed costs, again, facilities, you can see the numbers. So the total, in terms of what we get through EPS, is about 14 million for all of these categories. The total, according to what we need to budget for, is about 20 million. That is why every year, for those who have been to the budget meeting, there's a additional local amount. Because this is a sufficiency model, it doesn't pay for everything that a district actually needs to operate.
So, Jay,
Yes?
so this is an illustration of how the model that the state uses for EPS and how that's calculated doesn't work for our district necessarily. Maybe it doesn't work for any district, I don't know, but for our district, the impact is that staffing that is considered sufficient isn't sufficient for us because we can't have, one nurse or a half an administrator in
Correct.
the school.
Yep.
So we end up paying the bill for what we need beyond the state's calculation.
Correct.
And that's the difference that we have to make up in order to sufficiently staff our schools.
Yes. And in one of the letters I sent to families, it's more than that. It's not just that we're quote unquote overstaffed. They take the ratio. They plug our student numbers in, and then they say, for that number of students district-wide, you should have this many teachers. And if you have more than that, whatever percentage that is, they give you that much less. We are about 20% quote unquote overstaffed currently. So not only are we're paying for staff members that we're not receiving money for their salaries for. So the model is problematic. If we had a school of 750 kids, or elementary schools, standalone elementary schools of about 350, it would work pretty well. But we're a rural school district. Our transportation costs are way more because no one anticipates you're going to be on the road for 2 hours to get kids to school in the morning. It's just a model that doesn't fit rural districts very well.
Is my understanding correct that we're transporting kids out of state for special programs with the vans?
Out of state?
Apparently, some students have to go to Massachusetts for certain things, or we're transporting kids to other towns or whatnot for special programs.
We're transporting kids to other towns, yes.
So how is that working into our budget is that something that we can do away with? Programs that we can,
I'll get to that. That's part of it, and I will address that, I promise.
Quick question on the recommendations. Is that a new thing, or is that something that's always been the case, and you're just eliminating it?
you don't like my father.
The guidance from the state on the ratios?
That has always existed, yes.
So I'm curious
hate
why
so
that's such a focus of this budget.
Because when we have to make determinations about how to create a budget that people can support, that becomes a significant factor. Because really the only way we have to control our expenses is to be really thoughtful about staffing. We don't have the luxury of having full-time everything in this school and at New Suncook because those ratios just don't allow for that.
But that has always been the case.
It has and it hasn't. I mean, we went from having full-time administrators in this building, full-time administrators at New Suncook, full-time guidance. We've had less than full-time guidance at times. We've increased that. But we've had to make really challenging decisions every year that we've created a budget to keep that increase down. It's just that this year it's come to a head. And I promise I will get to what the original draft of this budget looked like and the reason why we had to make really tough decisions, and I hope that will answer your question. Is it true that the superintendent wants to close the Denmark school? This is a frequently asked question. No, I don't make the decision to close schools. What is there, that disclaimer? I was asked to give a presentation in August at a school board meeting. What is the process for closing a school? I think it's a reasonable question. I was asked by the school board to give a presentation, but my first slide, you're looking at it. The purpose is informational. In no way should this presentation be interpreted as lobbying for the closure of a school. I do not make those decisions. Just because something gets posted on social media doesn't make it true. So I don't know what else to say about that. If and when the decision is made to close the school, it will not be my decision. I will be responsible for navigating the process, but that is not a duty of the superintendent. I don't go to the school board and say, close the school. Budget drivers. Problematic. Again, I'm sure for those of you who are dealing with health insurance cost increases, we got notification, I think it might have been in March, that the Anthem rates statewide were increasing by 17.89%. That is a massive year-to-year increase. Because Anthem has a trust and they're able to sort of buy it down a little bit from year to year, they were able to do that to some degree, and then they tier districts based upon what is the money that employees pay in versus what are they needing in services, what are they needing for medications and things of that nature. We landed in the 12% category. That's $300,000 across the district for all categories of employees. We talked about Freiburg Academy tuition. We're anticipating a 5% increase. That's pretty standard. It goes up anywhere from 4.5% to 6% a year. We need to budget for that. IVF is a portion of the student tuition rate per student, which we pay so that Freiburg Academy can maintain its facilities. It's 6% this year, could be higher than that next year. We've negotiated teacher salaries, we've negotiated support staff contracts for ed techs and secretaries. We need curricular materials to support teachers, and we will need a new special education bus because one of our buses is reaching end of life, and we are required, if it is in a student's IEP, to have transportation. We need to do that. So again, if you think back to the first slide I showed you, doing nothing drives a $210,000 increase. These are not fluff. These are costs that we need to deal with. These are must-haves. We don't have the luxury of just passing along a $1.2 million increase on taxpayers in addition to that $210,000, in addition to all the other costs that increase that aren't even listed here.
How much are we spending on curriculum materials?
For next year, I've listed it. That was the 100,000.
That's the increase. What's the total cost we're spending on curriculum materials?
I don't believe, and Dana, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe there's really anything I'm thinking of. I mean, maybe photocopying of materials, maybe some student workbooks, but it's minimal.
Do we purchase our curriculum or do the teachers write their lesson plans?
For the most part, we have moved to district-wide curriculum for math. We use iReady for math. We've moved to district-wide for language arts in K-6. We've moved to a science curriculum called CPUP for 5-8.
What's
So
the increased cost of going into that kind of curriculum instead of having our teachers write lesson plans?
pardon?
And what is the increased cost of moving to going from teachers writing their lesson plans, which are more than capable of doing, what is the difference in cost between purchasing lesson plans instead of the teachers writing them as well and paying them to do so? What's the difference in cost, do you know?
For the programs that I just talked about, reading, math, and science.
Yes, I understand that, but there's gotta be a cost number attributed to that. Because we're paying these teachers who are more than capable of writing lesson plans, and this is part of their basic curriculum to become teachers. So therefore, my question is why are we paying for curriculum if we have staff that is more than capable of doing this?
Definitely.
Why are we paying for curriculum and why is the cost increasing?
I don't know that this is an appropriate time to get into a debate about what sort of
Well, this is
support the teachers need, but I would say that for consistency of instruction across the district, we have tried, everybody just focuses on meeting the needs of students,
Well,
and
I
they do it in
understand
their
that,
own
but
way.
we as
If you let me
taxpayers-
answer the question, I would be happy to. But that resulted in a lot of inconsistencies. I think that teachers deserve the materials to be able to do the job, especially since teaching is far more challenging in terms of attendance patterns, student behaviors, etc. And to not give teachers the tools to be successful is a mistake.
Yeah, I'm a licensed educator, I understand what's involved. But I'm also wondering why, if we have this, I would like, and this is a budget concern. We are paying for curriculum, and we are in a deficit. How can we make this deficit go away by maybe cutting costs? Maybe everybody has to pitch in, that includes the staff and the teaching staff, would you not agree?
I will address how we did cut costs.
Jay?
Yes.
Maybe what you don't understand, it's the materials the teachers are using to teach.
Yes, I'm aware of
So
that.
teachers can write their own,
Yes.
what they want the kids to do, but it's like having, when we were in school, books.
No, I
You
understand
needed
that.
books.
And my
It's the same
question
thing.
is the cost between us having books and teachers writing lesson plans, like when we went to school, what's the difference in the cost between us doing that and purchasing a fully